Congratulations, you just bought your first Lithops plant, and now it's probably either going to die a slow, miserable death, or maybe it'll just turn into a puddle of rot overnight. I kid, but the strange thing is, these cute little guys are weirdly enough sold as gateway plants into the world of succulents, even though they have incredibly specific needs. So in this video, I'm going to share with you everything you need to know about how to care for a Lithops plant, starting with taking it out of its pot from the nursery, giving it an appropriate soil mix, and then, most importantly, how to water it according to its very particular seasonal cycle. So if that sounds interesting, stick around and we'll help your new plant avoid a horrible death. If you've bought your plant from an online seller, it's going to come bare root, and you can probably skim over this section. But if you've purchased your plant from a garden centre or a nursery, it's going to come in a pot, and that pot will likely be filled with soil that is wildly inappropriate for growing Lithops in. So the first thing we're going to need to do is get it out of there, clean it up a bit, and get it into a new space. I'm going to be using this Lithops Caris montana seedling as my guinea pig. Desperate need of a larger pot. So what I'm going to do, get it out of its soil. Now, you don't have to be too gentle with them, all right? We're going to actually be removing a lot of the roots in this process anyway. So if you find that it's got a lot of roots through the pot and you're worried about them, be not afraid. So, going to tip out as much of this soil as I can. This is very dry, so it's coming out very easily for me. But if it's wet, you might need to be a bit more vigorous, and eventually the plant comes free. Now, little note about Lithops growth. You can see the paired leaves at the top here, and underneath they grow with one thick taproot and then a whole lot of small feeder roots. And these feeder roots will actually die off when they go through periods of drought. This plant hasn't been watered in a while, and so those feeder roots aren't even alive. I'm going to get rid of those in a moment, and I'll show you how. If your plant's been watered recently, those feeder roots might be growing. That's okay. It's not a problem either way. First thing I'm going to do is get rid of some of this excess soil that's clinging to the roots using a toothbrush. Just give it a bit of a brush like this. Some of those roots will come off as well. That's fine. And this, you can see, is what I'm left with. Now, I'm going to give this a bit of a tidy up. Got some fine scissors here. What I'm going to do is just trim off those feeder roots, as many as I can, ensuring I don't damage the body of the plant itself. You can see just getting rid of some of these roots. You can even shorten the taproot a little if you want to. It'll all grow back. So, it's a fairly modest trim. You can see now, this is a plant that's ready to go into its new home. There are a few traps that inexperienced Lithops growers can fall into. And the first of those is the nature of the soil mix that they use. These are plants that require incredibly coarse, inorganic or mineral soils in which to thrive. So dispel any notion of using a store-bought cactus and succulent mix for your new Lithops. It's going to be an absolute death sentence. Now you might argue with me, but I bought my plant and it came in cactus mix. Sure it did, but it also came from a nursery where they might be growing tens of thousands of these plants, and in any given year they might lose 30 or 40% of them to rot. It's the ones that survive that make it to the nurseries. Do you want to give your plant that chance of success? I wouldn't think so. So what I'm going to show you today is the mix that I would use to ensure my plant survives and thrives. So what you can see here are the components of my soil mix, and as is quite evident, most of this is mineral based or inorganic. Now, this isn't a rule book. You don't have to follow these ingredients to the letter. Note the properties of these different minerals, have a look at what you can get locally, and substitute as necessary. But I'll walk you through what I've got here. First of all, this is coarse pumice. Fantastic stuff, great for any mineral mix. All cacti and succulent mixes can do with a bit of pumice. Then, this is zeolite. Now, zeolite's a really interesting component that retains and slowly releases nutrients into your soil mix. Then we've got some decomposed granite, also releases trace minerals into any mix. Crushed sandstone, which is great for the soil structure. And then only 10% of this mix is organic, and this is our store-bought cactus mix, mostly sifted to get rid of any of the real chunky stuff. So I'm going to mix all this together, and the end result will be a soil that's suitable for my lithops to live in long-term, happily and healthily. Here we go, we're going to chuck all those ingredients in here, give them a bit of a swish around. These are a little bit moist, so they're not going to be too dusty. Ideally, we'll wash away most of the fines from these components anyway beforehand. If it wasn't moist, I'd be using a mask to prevent myself inhaling some of the nasty stuff that can come off these minerals. But here we go. Nothing quite like mixing up some soil. And there you go. What a beautiful mix this is going to be for that little baby lithops. Now I've got my mix, got my plant. What am I going to do for pot? Now there are different options here, but personally I like to use a tall plastic pot like this one. I spoke earlier about how these plants grow tap roots. What that means is they send out quite a long, deep root, enables them to go searching for moisture in habitat. And if you give them an appropriate pot, they can replicate that as well. Great way of enabling healthy and relatively rapid growth in your plants. They can also do with terracotta pots, that's fine as well. That quick drying nature of the porosity of those pots, also well suited. But for my climate, tall plastic pot, chuck that on there like that. Going to load this up with soil now, pop this in, and off we go. Bit of soil into that pot. Probably do with another one. There's that, look at that. Super chunky. I'm going to get those scissors. Just make a little hole in there. Pop the plant into. Fill it back in. At this point, might need to put a few more bits of soil on top just to fill it in. There we go. How good's that? It's going to be very happy for a very long time now in that pot. Now, the second trap that new lithops growers might fall into is where to put their plants. Now, unfortunately, these things are not indoor plants, and realistically, if you do grow them indoors, it's going to lead to probably a slow decline in plant health over time until eventually it just gives up. No, they need good airflow and they need plenty of light. You might be able to get away with growing one of these things on a windowsill if it's drenched with all day light, but then you're still going to need to worry about other climatic factors, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. They are plants that thrive in sunlight. You only have to see them growing in the wild to recognize that part shade or indoor conditions are not going to be appropriate. So this is going to live in full sun. Now, if you've just received your plant, whether it be from a garden centre or in the post, it's a good idea to transition it into full sun. Give it a little bit of sun every day, gradually increase that over time, over a span of about a week until it's ready to go. Otherwise, you might find that it gets sunburn. Now, if it does, if there are some cosmetic issues with your lithops, that's okay, because I'm going to talk about their annual cycle in a second, but that annual cycle is a fantastic way of dealing with cosmetic issues. Have a look at this plant. This is a Lithops julii. Incidentally, this is the first succulent I ever grew from seed, and my old mate Rat took a real good chew out of this a couple of weeks ago. You can imagine my excitement. However, a few months' time, you won't even see that, and that's because these plants have a seasonal cycle of renewal and rejuvenation, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. Now, the third and probably deadliest trap that any new lithops owner can fall into is to do with that process of annual rejuvenation. These are plants that go through very strict cycles every single year. And if we give them water at inappropriate times, it'll lead to almost certain death. Now, how do we know when to water them then? Well, if you familiarise yourself with this life cycle, it'll make your life so much easier. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to walk you through it. Start with spring. In the springtime, these plants are in active growth. They're uptaking water into their roots and plumping themselves up, essentially. You can water them probably 2 or 3 times over the springtime. How do we know when it's time to water? You'll start to see a couple of little wrinkles on the plant, a little bit like this. That's a good sign that it's due for a water. If it's not wrinkled, don't water it at all. Now, as temperatures start to rise and we enter into the heights of summer, particularly overnight temperatures, this will trigger a summer dormancy. When temperatures overnight reach about 23 or 24 degrees Celsius, the plant will stop growing altogether, those feeder roots will die off, and it won't uptake any water whatsoever. Watering during this period is an almost certain death sentence, and so it's imperative that you cut it out completely. Doesn't matter how wrinkled, how disheveled, how horrific your plant looks, do not be tempted to water it if those nighttime temperatures are high. As autumn arrives, the temperatures cool, that's when we can start watering again. Now, typically lithops will flower in the autumn, beautiful buds, yellow or white, and ordinarily what we will do is, again, taking note of those wrinkles on the plant body, we can water them 2 or 3 times again as needed up until the end of flowering. When the flowers die back, and sometimes you can see flowers will just look like a kind of dead brown husk. Sometimes if you've been lucky and they've been pollinated like this one, you'll get a little seed pod in the middle. Now, when those flowers die back, that becomes another sign. Withhold water, because now the plant is entering into its winter dormancy. The plant is in actual active growth in this period, but it doesn't want water, because what it's actually doing is it's transferring water from its current leaves into the new leaves that are growing inside the body of the plant. It's a transferal of water. And if you provide water at this time, what will happen is the leaves will start to stack upon each other. They'll become bloated, and your plant ultimately will be very unhealthy. Lithops are defined by these leaf pairs. You don't want 4, 6, 8 leaves coming out of the one plant body unless it's started to split and you've got multiple heads. But having stacked leaves upon each other, not a healthy plant. So over the winter time, we're again withholding water until the old leaves have completely sheathed over. You'll see, if I just poke around in here, you can see some remnants of old leaves in there. They're kind of the dry, woody looking things. Pests love to get into them. So when those old leaves have kind of sheathed over almost entirely, that's when you can start that spring watering again, because there's no more water to uptake from the old leaves. Now, if you do that and you follow that cycle, realistically, like I said, you might only be watering them 6-7 times a year. Pretty easy. They become really easy plants to care for if you've got them in the right soil mix and you're watering them at the appropriate times. But you don't follow that advice, and they are almost certainly going to die. The unfortunate thing is most people who buy them think they look cute. Isn't that adorable? And because they don't inform themselves, they consign them to a horrible, miserable death. So don't be one of those people. Follow the information provided here, and your lithops can grow happily for a very, very long time. These plants can grow huge. So, I hope you learned something out of this today. I'll see you next time with some more fascinating succulent and cactus advice. Happy growing.